Think of that. Remove tens of thousands of illegal alien gang members, drug dealers, murderers, child predators, human traffickers, fraudsters, and savage criminals.
At 4:11 a.m. in a freight corridor that never truly sleeps, federal officials stepped to a podium in Houston, Texas, and delivered a line that sounded like a warning shot. 52 tons of methamphetamine, multiple distribution nodes, and 20 public officials compromised. They called it the largest logistics infiltration investigators had ever documented on U.S. soil, an operation where the border wasn't just crossed, it was managed. And if you think this is just a drug case, stay with it. Because what agents found inside that Texas logistics hub wasn't just narcotics. It was a blueprint for control. By sunrise, the story would stop being about a shipment. It would become a story about a state system quietly rewired into a cartel-owned supply chain. And the next part is worse. At 4:32 a.m., the first strike teams rolled, not with sirens, not with spectacle, just black SUVs gliding through damp streets under the sick glow of warehouse neon, tires hissing on pavement still wet from a midnight mist. Houston's East Side industrial belt, endless fences, stacked containers, and loading bays like dark mouths looked empty. But it wasn't. It was waiting. Federal agents moved in layers, FBI in raid jackets, DEA tactical teams with breaching tools, ICE enforcement units staged for custody and transport, and local SWAT teams assigned perimeter. DEA's coordinators sat in an unmarked command van, radios low, voices clipped, every word measured. They were not hitting one target, they were hitting a system. At 4:34 a.m., the first door went. A steel personnel entrance on the side of a logistics warehouse listed under a harmless name, something that sounded like a family-owned shipping contractor. The lock didn't matter. The hinges didn't matter. In 2 seconds, it became splinters, flashbang, a hard white pop that turned shadows into photographs, then movement, agents flowing in tight formation through aisles of shrink-wrapped pallets and cardboard stacks that looked ordinary until you noticed what the forklifts had been moving at 2:00 a.m. for the last 6 months. Inside the first bay, they found pallets labeled as ceramic tile, but the tile was sealed in heat-welded plastic bricks. Methamphetamine. Not street bags. Not little bundles. Industrial packaging. The kind of narcotics you don't deal unless you're running a pipeline. By 4:39 a.m., teams were hitting a second location, an underground casino hidden behind a members-only sports bar 40 minutes away, where the lights never shut off and the cameras always pointed inward. The door staff didn't get to speak. They didn't even get to blink. Agents swept through poker tables, private rooms, a back office lined with watches and gold chains, and silent men with phone burners stacked like deck cards. A suspect made a break for a rear exit with a duffel bag. He made it 8 steps. He went down hard, face to floor, while another man reached for a concealed pistol and froze the moment a rifle light burned into his eyes. By 4:46 a.m., the third site lit up, an import warehouse near a rail spur where freight cars parked for hours without anyone asking why. The breach team moved fast, cutting through a roll-up door with a grinding scream that carried down the empty road. Inside, the smell. Not gasoline, not food. Chemicals. Acetone, solvent, the sharp bite of precursors clinging to concrete. They found lab glassware in crates, vacuum sealers still warm, a corner office with a counting machine mid-spin, and then, in a locked interior room, something that didn't belong in a simple dope stash. A server rack, humming, and beside it, 3 sealed steel boxes, each stamped with inventory codes that didn't match any manifest in the building. Not cartel graffiti, not cartel flags, just clean corporate labeling, like it was supposed to look normal, like someone expected it to be audited. The seizures came in numbers that sounded unreal even to seasoned agents, but they were documented, weighed, logged. 52 tons of methamphetamine connected to the corridor, packaged for movement, not for sale. Thousands of fentanyl pills in vacuum packs, hidden inside auto parts crates. Kilograms of cocaine in shrink-wrapped bricks stacked behind pallets of paper goods. And cash, bundled so tight with bands it looked like construction material. By 5:18 a.m., as suspects were cuffed on cold concrete and forklifts sat abandoned with keys still in the ignition, one of the evidence technicians opened the first steel box. No drugs inside, no cash, just files. Paper ledgers printed on thick stock, a dozen encrypted storage devices, and one binder, black cover, no label. Inside was a single page with a title line that made the room go quiet. A phrase that sounded like an internal government program. A code name. Project Lone Star Vale. At 7:06 a.m. inside a federal cyber forensics lab, fluorescent lights, humming air filtration, coffee gone cold, analysts began working the drives. This is where cases usually become paperwork. This is where drama dies. But not this time. Because this wasn't just encrypted. It was engineered. The kind of encryption you see in corporate defense contracts, not a street-level drug ring. They ran extraction. They ran brute force. They pulled metadata, timestamps, device fingerprints. Then at 8:41 a.m., a visualization bloomed across a wall-mounted screen, a network diagram, nodes connected by lines, cities tied to companies, tied to bank accounts, tied to officials. Houston, Dallas, Fort Worth, Laredo, Pharr, El Paso, freight hubs, rail yards, warehouses, and underneath the corporate names, shell structures with layers like armor, sham charities with patriotic branding, fake nonprofit foundations claiming community redevelopment, restaurant chains that never seemed to have customers but always had cash flow, logistics firms with government contracts, a green infrastructure consortium receiving grants that were routed cleanly, quietly into offshore accounts. The money didn't move like cartel cash, it moved like policy. One analyst found an authorization key embedded in a procurement document, an encrypted signature used to approve expedited corridor exceptions. At first, it looked like an internal state routing code. But when they traced the key, it resolved to a user profile on a secured portal used for freight oversight. A profile tied to one person, the Texas State Logistics Commissioner, a man whose public image was spotless, an infrastructure reformer, a favorite at ribbon cuttings, someone who spoke about modernizing supply chains and protecting commerce. His name was Commissioner Alton R. Wexler, and on those drives, behind layers of encryption and false directories, Wexler's signature appeared again and again. Approving corridor shutdowns, approving way station maintenance windows, approving priority clearance routes. The dates matched the movements of narcotics loads. The times matched border crossings. The exemptions matched convoys that, on paper, didn't exist. The lab supervisor stared at the screen for a long moment and said it out loud, like he needed to hear it in the open air. This is not corruption. This is command-level collusion. Because this wasn't a governor taking bribes. This wasn't a mayor turning a blind eye. This was an official who had turned the Texas logistics corridor into a protected artery, a cartel pipeline disguised as commerce. The cartel name surfaced across the documents, never written openly, always coded. But the pattern was unmistakable. The Jung Cartel, the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, wasn't just moving product through Texas. It was using Texas as a distribution brain. a hub, a fortress made of forklifts, manifests, and political signatures. At 10:03 a.m., the lab team sent an encrypted report to a task force command channel. The message ended with one line: Phase 2 authorized. And that's the moment the case stopped being about a warehouse. Because once you identify the person authorizing the flow, the next phase is not a raid, it's an eradication. At 3:17 a.m. the following morning, inside a command center outside Dallas, a wall-sized digital map glowed in the dark. Dozens of red markers pulsed like infected wounds across Texas. Freight depots, trucking yards, private airstrips, border warehouses, a mansion in the hills north of Austin, a philanthropy office in downtown Houston, a chain of wellness clinics along the I-35 corridor that ICE intelligence had linked to migrant smuggling and human trafficking transit. The map wasn't a list of crimes, it was a cartel architecture, and the federal response was scaled accordingly. Over 1,100 federal agents across multiple agencies, dozens of tactical teams, armored vehicles staged in industrial lots, Black Hawk helicopters idling at remote airfields, rotors ticking in the darkness like a countdown. Fixed-wing surveillance assets overhead, silent and high. Border, air, and marine units positioned along choke points, and the message repeated through briefings with the same cold clarity. Simultaneous. No leaks. No mercy. At 4:05 a.m., the first wave went green. In Houston, agents hit a cargo brokerage office where the front desk had motivational posters about integrity and teamwork. The back room told the truth. A hidden comms hub, encrypted radios, stacks of blank bills of lading, a wall-mounted monitor showing live feeds of loading bays, angles that only mattered if you were protecting shipments. In Dallas-Fort Worth, tactical teams struck a cold storage facility where refrigerated trucks sat lined up like a fleet. Inside one trailer, insulation panels removed, cavities packed with narcotics bricks. In Laredo, agents swept a freight yard where a tunnel entrance had been cut beneath a maintenance shed, reinforced, powered, ventilated. Not a crude hole, a professional corridor. Not for one desperate crossing, for repeated traffic, for years. In the desert outside San Antonio, a warehouse that looked abandoned wasn't. The door was welded shut from the outside. Inside, a drug superlab, industrial mixers, press equipment, chemical drums, plastic barrels, ventilation systems rigged to vent through fake HVAC units. The smell hit agents before the lights did. In the hills west of Austin, a raid team rolled up to a mansion with perfect landscaping and a private security gate. They didn't ring. They cut power, breached the side entry, and moved like a blackout. Inside, marble floors, art on the walls, a quiet life purchased with poison. They found safes, they found weapons, they found ledgers, and they found a room behind a hidden door built like a command suite. Screens, maps, schedules, a board with pinned routes and coded notes. This wasn't a cartel hideout. This was a control room. By 9:22 a.m., custody buses were moving. Key cartel members were on the ground, handlers, coordinators, money movers, logistics planners. And then, the arrests that changed the gravity of the entire story. A state procurement director, 2 county commissioners, a city council member tied to a port advisory board, a judge with offshore payments routed through a faith foundation, and finally, the man at the center of the signature trail, Commissioner Alton R. Wexler, taken into custody in a private office with a state seal on the wall behind him. As he was let out, he didn't shout, he didn't plead, he didn't look surprised. He looked insulted, like the system was supposed to protect him. In 6 hours, the underworld took more damage than it had in the last 6 years. But the operation wasn't done, because the worst part of cartel infiltration is never the drugs, it's the badge. At 11:48 a.m., investigators began the next stage in a secure evidence facility, pulling logs, transactions, internal emails, and patrol scheduling data. This is where the betrayal becomes measurable. They built a timeline. They compared convoy crossings to patrol grids, and the pattern emerged like a stain spreading through paper. Border relaxations timed to specific trucks, way stations mysteriously offline during high-volume movements, internal radio chatter that went silent minutes before a convoy rolled through, then resumed like nothing happened. Leak points that explained why previous raids had come up empty, why doors were always already open, why suspects were always already gone. They identified the compromised. Not one or two. Dozens, then more. 41 law enforcement personnel flagged for direct cartel payments routed through shell companies. 17 border-adjacent officials tied to falsified inspection records. Several internal planners, people whose job was to coordinate public safety, caught in message chains where raid schedules were traded like currency. Federal agents made arrests inside stations that had American flags on the wall and memorial plaques in the hallway. A senior sergeant taken in handcuffs while his own officers watched, stunned and silent. A deputy chief removed from his office, his badge placed into an evidence bag like it was a weapon. An internal logistics liaison someone trusted, found with a second phone that only rang when cartel shipments moved. And the honest officers, the ones who stayed clean, they didn't look angry. They looked hollow. Like they'd spent years holding the line, unaware the line was being redrawn behind them. One veteran investigator said, quietly, after reviewing the files, "What we're looking at is a second secret police force. A parallel enforcement system. Not protecting citizens. Protecting cargo." By late afternoon, federal teams were still pulling data, server logs, payroll records, encrypted chats, and it became clear this wasn't a handful of bad people. This was an embedded mechanism, a machine built to outlast elections, to survive scrutiny, to keep the corridor open no matter who asked questions. The promise from federal leadership was blunt. The badge will be rebuilt from the ground up. And then the map expanded. Because Texas, investigators realized, wasn't the end point. It was the switchboard. At 6:29 p.m., analysts zoomed out to a national flowchart. Routes from the border into Texas, then branching outward like arteries, loads moving north under legitimate trucking contractors, shipping manifests altered at the port level, agricultural routes used as cover, produced shipments that moved too fast to inspect without spoilage, way stations under maintenance at the precise hours convoys passed, fuel card purchases mapped like breadcrumbs. From Texas, the network touched multiple states, distribution warehouses, short-term stash houses, regional brokers. The meth wasn't just for one city. It was for an entire market. And the operation used more than drugs to hide itself. It used people. Migrant smuggling corridors used as distraction routes, pulling attention and resources while narcotics shipments moved through separate lanes. Human trafficking houses used as holding points, controlled through fear, guarded by men who didn't talk because they didn't need to. The Chung cartel wasn't just profiting, it was testing something bigger. A blueprint to turn a U.S. logistics corridor into a long-term headquarters. Protected by policy, shielded by officials, stabilized by corruption, disguised as governance. Then investigators opened a final folder buried in the seized server. A phase document, not a ledger. A plan. It described a multi-year expansion with language that sounded like strategic development, corridor permanence, political stabilization, legacy insulation, a future where the system didn't just tolerate the cartel, it served it. And the chilling realization hit like a quiet gunshot. This wasn't a state being infiltrated, it was a state being redesigned for the cartel future. Now listen carefully, because stories like this don't end at the courthouse steps, they end in neighborhoods, They end in emergency rooms. They end in families who don't understand how a single pill became a funeral. Fentanyl, cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine. They don't just poison bodies, they erode trust. They hollow out communities. They turn working streets into hunting grounds for dealers in grief. And the most dangerous part is this: power does not always need open violence. Sometimes it only needs silence. Sometimes it only needs ambition. Sometimes it only needs one official with the authority to sign a form and the hunger to sell the entire system. So if you are still watching, don't let this become background noise. Tap like so more people see this story. And comment expose if you want this kind of corruption dragged into the light. Every signature, every shell company, every compromised badge. Because the moment a cartel stops fearing the law is the moment the law has to prove it still exists.